I used to think the most indestructible thing on my grandpa's ranch was the old red Massey tractor that hadn't missed a harvest in 50 years, but I was wrong. It turned out to be a mailbox. And not just any mailbox, but the one Grandpa decided to build after the so-called HOA cops made it their personal mission to run over the first 3 he had installed. I can still remember the sound of the last one getting flattened, steel bending against the bumper of a shiny white SUV, the laughter of a passenger spilling out the window, and my grandfather standing there on the porch with his arms crossed, shaking his head like he was calculating something only he knew the math for. That was the day the war officially began, though none of us realized it at the time. The first mailbox hadn't lasted long. Grandpa had ordered it online, a standard black one with a red flag that looked like every other rural box lining the county road. He'd set it in concrete, proud of how neat it looked standing there against the backdrop of wheat fields and rolling fences. 2 weeks later, it was nothing but a crumpled can with tire tracks leading straight back to the HOA president's subdivision. The cops, as they liked to call themselves, weren't real police. They were a self-appointed patrol committee of middle-aged dads who had apparently decided their /900,000 homes gave them jurisdiction over the rest of the county. They had badges printed at Kinko's, reflective vests, and magnetic decals for their SUVs that said HOA Safety Division. To them, patrolling meant driving too fast on rural roads, shining flashlights into barns they didn't own, and pretending that busting teenagers for fishing in drainage ponds was law enforcement. To Grandpa, it meant they were bullies with too much time and too little backbone. The second mailbox was sturdier. Grandpa cemented the post twice as deep, wrapped it in duct tape for good measure, and told me it'd survive anything short of a tornado. He was wrong. This time the HOA patrol car didn't just clip it, they lined up and drove over it deliberately. I know because I watched from the upstairs window while they backed up twice to make sure the post snapped clean. My fists clenched against the windowsill. I wanted to charge outside, scream, maybe even throw a rock at their taillights, but Grandpa pulled me back gently by the shoulder. "Not yet," he said in that gravelly voice of his, the one that meant patience wasn't optional. "They think they're clever. We'll let them think that for now." By the time the third mailbox got smashed, flattened so completely the flag was embedded in the dirt like a tombstone, it was clear this wasn't a random act. The HOA cops were using Grandpa's mailbox for target practice. Maybe they hated that his ranch didn't fall under their HOA jurisdiction. Maybe they thought an old man on a dirt road was too easy a mark. Or maybe they just liked the idea of showing off power in front of their buddies. Whatever their reasons, they underestimated who they were messing with. My grandfather wasn't the type to write long complaint letters or call sheriffs who'd shrug off property damage. He was the type who fought in Korea, fixed his own fences, and once chased a coyote out of the chicken coop with nothing but a broom handle. The HOA cops thought they were running over metal boxes. They were really running over his pride, and that was something he'd never let slide. I remember the night he decided to fight back. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the yellow light buzzing overhead, 2 mugs of black coffee between us. He spread out a piece of paper, drew a rough sketch of a mailbox, and tapped his pencil against it. "If they want to keep running it down, let's give them something worth hitting," he said. I asked him what he meant, and he only smirked. That smirk, the one that creased the corners of his eyes, meant he already had the plan built in his head. I leaned back, suddenly realizing I was watching the opening move of a chess game my grandfather had every intention of winning. The weeks that followed felt like we were part of some covert operation. He drove us into town under the pretense of buying feed, but instead we stopped by the scrapyard. He spent an hour sorting through steel beams until he found one he said would do the trick. Back at the ranch, he welded late into the night, sparks flying like fireflies under the barn's tin roof. He wouldn't let me touch the welder, but he had me measuring bolts, holding the flashlight steady, and writing down numbers in his grease-stained notebook. When I asked him what all the extra steel plates were for, he just winked and said, "Insurance." The finished product was hidden under an old tarp in the barn, and he made me promise not to say a word. Secrecy was part of the satisfaction, he explained. If they didn't see it coming, it'd sting twice as bad. The anticipation built like a drumbeat. Every night, the HOA cops drove their usual loop, engines growling, headlights sweeping across the ranch road. They laughed loud enough for us to hear from the porch. One even shouted, "How's the mailbox hunt going?" as they passed by. Grandpa only tipped his hat in return, calm as a stone. But inside the barn, under that tarp, the trap was ready. And when he finally installed it, he did it so quietly that even I didn't realize until morning. I walked out, bleary-eyed, and there it was, a new mailbox standing proud, but not like any I'd seen before. The post was disguised in wood to look ordinary, but underneath I knew it was solid steel. The box itself gleamed black and sharp, bolted down with reinforcements that made the ground around it tremble if you tapped it. It looked like a normal mailbox to anyone driving by. To me, it looked like a landmine waiting to be triggered. That evening, Grandpa sat back in his porch chair, pipe smoke curling around his hat brim, eyes fixed on the dirt road. I sat beside him, heart pounding harder with every approaching set of headlights. When the HOA patrol SUV slowed near the mailbox, I swear I could hear the grin stretching across Grandpa's face. They revved the engine, lined up like they always did, and stomped the gas. The impact sounded like thunder. Instead of the satisfying crunch of metal giving way, there was a shriek of tearing steel and the sharp whine of an airbag deploying. The SUV lurched to a dead stop, smoke pouring from the hood. For a split second, silence blanketed the ranch. Then came the shouting. The driver stumbled out, clutching his chest, cursing loud enough to echo across the field. His buddy ran around the front, staring wide-eyed at the mangled bumper hanging like loose teeth. And there, still standing tall and unbent, was Grandpa's mailbox, not even scratched. I couldn't hold back the laugh that exploded from my chest. It was the kind of laugh that bubbles out when justice finally tips in your favor, the kind that hurts your ribs because you've held it in so long. Grandpa didn't laugh. He just puffed his pipe, steady as ever, and said, "Told you. Patience." But I saw the corners of his mouth twitch, the smallest crack in his stoic mask. He'd won the first round, and he knew it. The HOA cops hadn't just hit a mailbox. They'd hit the wall of a man who wasn't about to be bullied off his land. The next morning the sun cut through the blinds and I woke up to the sound of hammers tapping, which was strange because I hadn't heard that rhythm in months. Grandpa was already outside, patching the fence line as if nothing had happened the night before. When I walked down the porch steps, the first thing I noticed was that the HOA cop's SUV was gone, though the oil stain it left behind was still dark on the dirt road. The second thing I noticed was the smell of bacon drifting from the kitchen window. That's how it always was with him. Life went on, chores first, breakfast next, and a mailbox war tucked neatly into the background like it wasn't eating at me. He had the patience of a man who had already survived harder battles. I didn't. My blood was still hot from watching those clowns crumple their shiny SUV into the steel post. I wanted fireworks, I wanted confrontation, but Grandpa moved like we were still in the first inning of a long ball game. By mid-morning, the gossip had already spread. Our ranch road didn't carry much traffic, but in a county this small, one wrecked HOA patrol SUV was enough to fuel an entire week's worth of conversations at the diner. I rode my bike into town that afternoon and couldn't even order a milkshake before I overheard two men in overalls laughing about how the neighborhood cops got beat up by a mailbox. The sheriff himself strolled in while I was sipping on strawberry, and he didn't look amused. He sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and muttered something about property owners pushing limits. When he caught me looking, he gave a nod that felt half like a greeting and half like a warning. I biked home faster than usual, stomach twisting, because I realized we weren't just poking at some bored suburban dads anymore. We were poking the bear of small-town authority, the kind that pretended neutrality until their golf buddies started whining. Sure enough, they came back that evening. Not with the wrecked SUV. No, that one was sitting in a repair shop, I imagined, but with two more, cleaner and newer, headlights bright against the fading sunset. This time they didn't try to run the mailbox down. They parked in the road, doors slamming shut in unison, boots crunching gravel as four of them walked toward the porch. Their reflective vests caught the dying light, their fake badges pinned proudly to their chests. I stepped forward instinctively, fists balling up, but Grandpa stopped me with one word. Stay. He leaned back in his rocking chair, pipe in hand, eyes steady like the ranch itself was watching through him. The tallest one, a broad-shouldered man with a receding hairline, was clearly their leader. He looked at the mailbox first, then at Grandpa. "Sir, you're creating a safety hazard," he declared, voice too loud for the quiet evening. "Your mailbox caused a serious accident last night. Our driver could have been killed." Grandpa didn't even blink. He puffed once, let the smoke curl, and said, "Then maybe your driver ought to keep his wheels on the road." That's simple. No drama, no apology. Just the kind of truth that stripped the bark off a tree. The man's face turned red, his jaw working like he wanted to spit but couldn't find words sharp enough. Another stepped in, younger, eager to prove himself. "We've got authority from the Homeowners Association to regulate road safety in this area." That made me snort before I could stop myself. Grandpa raised an eyebrow, and I swallowed the rest of my laugh. He set his pipe down gently and asked, "Which homeowners?" "Because last I checked, this land's been in my name for 60 years, and your association stops 5 miles east at the cul-de-sac." The younger one shifted uncomfortably, but the leader waved him silent. They weren't here to argue facts. They were here to intimidate. And Grandpa wasn't budging. The leader took a step closer, lowering his voice like he thought that would make it more threatening. "You can either take that contraption down, or we'll escalate this matter formally." That word, formally, hung in the air like a storm cloud. My gut told me it meant lawyers, citations, or worse, some half-baked collaboration with the sheriff's office. I wanted Grandpa to argue back, to stand up and shout them off his land, but he only leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You boys do whatever you think you need to do," he said calmly. "Mailbox isn't going anywhere." The silence that followed was heavier than their threats. They muttered something about consequences and walked back to their SUVs, tail lights glowing red as they sped off. Grandpa lit his pipe again like they'd never been there. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath us, and he was still sitting steady as a rock. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about escalation, about what formal might mean. Would they show up with legal papers? With more cars? With real cops? My imagination kept circling darker and darker. I finally crept to the window and looked out at the mailbox standing proud under the moonlight. It didn't look like steel anymore. It looked like a dare. And I wondered how much longer we could keep daring them before something snapped. 2 days later, something did. Not at the mailbox this time, but at the feed store. Grandpa and I were loading sacks of grain when one of the HOA patrol guys swaggered in, still wearing his reflective vest like it was a sheriff's badge. He made a point of standing too close, of staring down at me, and then he, accidentally, knocked one of our sacks off the dolly. Grain spilled across the floor like a waterfall. I froze, heat rising in my chest, but before I could move, Grandpa grabbed the man's wrist mid-motion. His grip looked casual, but I saw the guy wince, his smug expression flicker into something that looked a lot like fear. Grandpa leaned in just close enough for him to hear and said, "Son, I'm too old to play these games. Pick up the sack." The man swallowed hard, bent down, and did it. That was the first time I realized Grandpa didn't need to shout or threaten. His quiet was louder than any of them could handle. Still, the message was clear. They weren't backing down. They wanted revenge, and they were willing to play dirty to get it. That night, While we were fixing the hinges on the barn door, I asked him straight out, "Are we in over our heads?" He chuckled low, wiped the grease from his hands and said, "Over our heads? Boy, we ain't even at the waist yet. Just you wait." That answer didn't calm me, but it did light a spark of curiosity. He wasn't just defending a mailbox anymore. He was drawing lines, and I could sense he already had the next 10 moves planned out. The next escalation came in the form of paperwork. A week later, we got a letter in the mail stamped with the HOA's official seal. According to them, our mailbox was in violation of community safety standards and needed to be removed immediately. They even had the audacity to include a fine schedule, $50 a day until compliance. Grandpa read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it under his coffee cup like it was nothing more than a placemat. When I asked him what we should do, he said, "We'll respond in kind." That night he typed up his own letter on the ranch's old typewriter, short and precise. "This property is outside the jurisdiction of your association. Any further harassment will be considered trespassing. Sincerely, the owner." He mailed it back without ceremony. It was like watching two chess players exchanging pieces without touching the clock yet. The sheriff showed up 3 days later, and that was when I knew the game had shifted into a whole new level. It wasn't unusual to see him driving around the back roads, but he'd never pulled into our gravel driveway before, never parked his cruiser by the porch like he owned the place. I was splitting firewood when I heard the crunch of tires and looked up to see the familiar tan uniform stepping out, hat tipped low against the sun. Grandpa didn't move from his chair on the porch. He just puffed his pipe, steady as ever, while I wiped sweat off my forehead and tried to guess how bad this was going to get. The sheriff wasn't a stranger to our family. He'd been elected 5 years earlier, a smooth talker who loved pancake breakfasts and Rotary Club speeches about keeping the county safe and prosperous. Safe for whom was always the unspoken question. I'd seen him shaking hands at the HOA subdivision cookouts, his cruiser parked out front like an honored guest. That was all I needed to know about where his loyalties lay. He nodded at me on his way up the steps, but his eyes were fixed on Grandpa. "Afternoon, Mr. Daniels," he said in a tone that carried more authority than courtesy. Grandpa tipped his hat in return, calm as a man greeting the mail carrier. The sheriff wasted no time. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket and laid it on the porch table. "We've had multiple complaints about your mailbox. Apparently it's a hazard to vehicles. I'm going to need you to remove it." I stepped forward, ready to explode. A hazard? What about the hazard of their SUVs barreling down our road like they were on a racetrack? What about the hazard of them deliberately ramming into private property for sport? Before I could open my mouth, Grandpa raised one hand, the kind of slow, deliberate gesture that silenced me instantly. He picked up the paper, glanced at it, then set it down again. "Sheriff," he said in that low, gravelly voice, "my mailbox is on my land. It's built within county specs. If your boys want to keep driving into it, maybe they should learn how to steer." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to defiance from men like Grandpa. Most folks around here bent when the county leaned. But my grandfather had been through wars, recessions, and droughts that would break a lesser man. He didn't scare easy. The sheriff tried again, softer this time, like he was offering a compromise. "Look, I'm not saying you don't have the right to put a mailbox on your property. I'm just saying this one's excessive. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Grandpa puffed once, let the smoke curl into the air, and said, "Too late." And just like that, the conversation ended. The sheriff left with a stiff nod, but the message was clear. The HOA had managed to drag him into it. They weren't playing petty games anymore. They were pulling in the system to do their dirty work. That night, Grandpa sat me down at the kitchen table. He poured 2 glasses of iced tea and slid one my way. "You see what they're doing?" he asked. I nodded, but he wanted me to say it out loud. "They're trying to wear you down. They think if they stack enough pressure, you'll cave. He smiled, a thin line under his mustache. That's their mistake. They don't know how long I can sit. I wanted to believe him, but a knot twisted in my stomach. Patience might win chess matches, but we weren't playing chess with gentlemen. We were playing against people who wore fake badges and swung sledgehammers at night. Patience wasn't going to stop them from escalating again. The next escalation came faster than I expected. A week later, I was riding the tractor back from the south pasture when I saw dust clouds on the ranch road. 3 SUVs this time, not 2. They pulled up right in front of the mailbox, blocking the road like a barricade. I killed the engine and watched from the field as half a dozen men piled out, all in vests, all carrying something in their hands. At first I thought it was more sledgehammers, but as I got closer, I saw they weren't hammers. They were chains and tow strap. They were going to rip the mailbox clean out of the ground. I jumped off the tractor, heart pounding, but before I could sprint toward them, Grandpa appeared from the barn. He walked slow, deliberate, hands in his pockets like he was just out for an evening stroll. The men were already looping straps around the post, hooking chains to the front of their lead SUV. The leader barked an order and the engine roared to life, wheels spinning, dirt flying. The chain snapped taut, and then snapped clean in half with a sound like a gunshot. The SUV lurched forward, bumper bent inward, radiator hissing steam. The men cursed, shouting at each other, trying again with a second strap. Same result. The post didn't budge an inch. It was like watching ants try to drag a mountain. Grandpa stood there the whole time, silent, arms crossed. Finally, when they gave up and started shouting about bringing in heavier equipment, he spoke. You boys keep wasting money on repairs if you want. Doesn't matter to me. Mailbox isn't going anywhere. His calm infuriated them more than if he'd yelled. One of the younger guys, red-faced and wild-eyed, actually tried to swing a chain at him. Before I could even blink, Grandpa caught it midair with one hand. He didn't pull or push. He just held it, steady, like a stone pillar anchoring the whole scene. The man froze, the rest of them silent in shock. Then Grandpa dropped the chain at his feet and walked back to the porch. They left soon after, beaten not by force but by the unshakable weight of his presence. But humiliation breeds desperation, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they tried something bigger. That night I barely slept, staring at the ceiling, replaying the chain snapping, the bumper crumpling, the rage on their faces. They weren't going to stop. They couldn't stop, not now. Their pride was on the line. And pride makes men stupid. The next blow didn't land on the mailbox. It landed on us. I woke up 2 mornings later to find our front gate padlock cut clean through, tire tracks carved into the driveway leading up to the barn. We rushed inside, and my stomach dropped at the sight. Feed sacks slit open and spilled everywhere. Toolboxes overturned, the welder knocked off its stand. It wasn't theft. They hadn't taken anything of value. It was vandalism. A message. They wanted us to know they could reach inside our property, past our fences, and leave their mark. I felt my chest burn with rage, but Grandpa only sighed. Now it's official, he said quietly. They've declared war. I expected him to call the sheriff, but he didn't. He didn't even take photos for evidence. Instead, he started cleaning up, methodical, almost calm. I stormed around, demanding we report it, threatening to do it myself, but he shook his head. Calling them won't fix this. You don't fight fire by begging the wind to stop blowing. You fight it by building stone walls. I didn't know what he meant at the time, but I soon would. That day he drew up new plans, bigger than before. The mailbox was no longer just a mailbox. It was becoming a fortress. The convoy rolled up slow, engines growling in unison like a pack of wolves testing the edge of the herd. 5 SUVs lined the dirt road, headlights glaring against the dusk, dust still swirling around them. I could feel the vibration in the porch boards under my boots, the kind of tension that makes the air heavier. Grandpa didn't flinch. He sat there, pipe clenched between his teeth, rocking chair creaking with each steady push. I hovered behind him, my pulse hammering, my mouth dry as chalk. There was no mistaking it this time. This wasn't intimidation. This was escalation, the kind that ends in either surrender or collision. The doors opened one by one, and out came a small army of HOA patrolmen, all puffed-up chests and reflective vests. Some carried flashlights, others carried clipboards like they were going to write citations on the side of a rural dirt road. The leader stepped forward, same broad-shouldered man as before, his SUV bumper still bent from his last failed attempt. His face looked pinched, eyes hard, jaw tight with barely concealed rage. He pointed at the mailbox first, then at Grandpa. "This ends tonight," he barked. "You either take that thing down right now or we'll do it for you." Grandpa didn't answer immediately. He puffed once, let the smoke curl, then finally said, "You boys sure do like repeating yourselves." The porch light buzzed above us, cutting a weak circle into the growing dark. The men shifted, murmuring among themselves. They hadn't come for another debate. They'd come to crush his spirit, maybe even break the steel if they could. I could see tow hooks gleaming on the front of 2 SUVs, chains coiled on the ground, heavy-duty winches strapped to their bumpers. They weren't leaving until they'd tried everything. The leader waved his hand, and 2 of them moved to wrap the chains around the mailbox post. Grandpa watched them calmly, but my insides screamed. I wanted to yell, to push them back, to fight, but Grandpa's silence held me frozen. The first SUV revved, the chain snapped taut, wheels spinning dirt into the air. The mailbox didn't budge. The steel base groaned but held firm. The SUV bucked backward, smoke hissing from the hood. Cheers erupted from the other men, not for us but for the effort. The leader cursed, waved for the second SUV to join. They hooked both chains, 2 engines roaring together, straining with all their horsepower. The ground trembled, the chains rattled, the air filled with the whine of engines pushed too hard. And still, the mailbox stood, unmovable, like a stubborn oak against a storm. When the second chain snapped and coiled back like a snake, smashing into one man's shin and sending him howling, the whole scene descended into chaos. Men shouted, flashlights swung wildly, someone kicked the dirt in frustration. I bit my tongue to stop from laughing, but the thrill of victory pulsed through me. Grandpa finally stood, slow and deliberate, pipe smoke swirling around his head. "You're making fools of yourselves," he said simply, and his words carried heavier than any shouting could. That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable man would have accepted defeat, swallowed his pride, and driven home. But these weren't reasonable men. Their pride was the only thing they had, and pride cuts deeper than steel. The leader's face flushed crimson. "Fine," he snarled. "If you won't take it down, we'll take you down with it." He snapped his fingers, and 3 men moved toward the porch. My chest tightened. They weren't just here for property anymore. They were here for intimidation, maybe even violence. I stepped forward instinctively, planting myself between them and Grandpa. My fists curled, ready for the first swing. The tallest man smirked, clearly amused by a kid trying to play guard dog. But then Grandpa laid a hand on my shoulder and gently pulled me back. His voice was calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut the air. "Careful, boys. Last I checked, trespassing and assault are still crimes in this county. You really want the sheriff explaining that one in court?" The words hung there, heavy and undeniable. For a moment they hesitated. I could see the calculation flickering behind their eyes, how far they were willing to go, how much risk they were ready to shoulder. They wanted domination, but they didn't want jail time. Not yet. The leader spat into the dirt, motioned for them to back off. "This isn't over, old man," he hissed. "You think you've won because you've got a steel box in the ground. But we've got more resources than you can imagine. We'll bury you in fines, lawsuits, citations, inspections, you name it. And when you're too tired to fight, we'll be right here to watch it all crumble." Then they piled back into their SUVs, engines roaring as they sped off into the night, leaving tire scars carved deep into the road. The silence afterward felt suffocating. I turned to Grandpa, expecting him to look rattled, maybe even worried. But he only relit his pipe, sat back down, and rocked slowly. "Let them talk," he said. "Talk's all they got." I wanted to believe him, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. They weren't bluffing. They had money, lawyers, connections. We had a mailbox and an old man with more grit than common sense. It didn't feel like a fair fight. The next morning, the fight came to our doorstep in the form of envelope. A stack of certified letters arrived, each one stamped with HOA seals and legal jargon. Violations, fines, cease and desist notices. Each more absurd than the last. They accused us of obstructing traffic, endangering lives, operating without permits, even lowering property values. Grandpa flipped through them like junk mail, unimpressed. He set the stack aside, poured himself coffee, and asked if I wanted eggs with mine. His calmness infuriated me. "Aren't you worried?" I demanded. He shrugged. "Letters don't scare me. If they had a real case, the county would be here, not their secretaries." But I wasn't convinced. Words on paper might not dent steel, but they could bankrupt a man just the same. Over the following week, the harassment escalated. Strangers we'd never seen before parked at the end of our driveway, watching with binoculars. Anonymous calls rang our landline at all hours, heavy breathing or shouted insults before hanging up. One night, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. Someone had thrown a rock through our barn window. I stormed outside with a flashlight, but whoever did it was already gone, tire tracks fading into the dark. Each act chipped away at my nerves, each one daring us to react. But Grandpa stayed unmoved. He patched the window, fixed the fence, swept the broken glass. "No complaints, no calls to the sheriff. They want a reaction," he said. "We don't give it to them. That's how you win." Still, even I could see the toll it was taking. He moved slower some mornings, rubbed his temples longer at night, coughed harder when the pipe smoke settled in his chest. The fight wasn't breaking his spirit, but it was wearing on his body. And that terrified me. Because if he fell, the whole battle would collapse with him. I wasn't ready to hold that weight alone. The week after the backhoe fiasco felt almost too quiet, and that's what unsettled me most. For the first time in months, there were no SUV headlights crawling the road at night, no anonymous calls rattling the landline, no fresh letters stamped with HOA seals arriving in the mailbox. The men who had once strutted around like tin soldiers were suddenly absent, leaving only the cicadas and the wind through the cornfields to break the silence. Grandpa acted like nothing had changed. He fixed the tractor belt, sharpened tools, even took time to mend the sagging barn door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't peace, it was plotting. I told him that one evening as we sat on the porch, fireflies blinking over the fields. He puffed his pipe, eyes fixed on the horizon, and said, "That's how you know they're desperate. Noise is easy. Silence takes planning." My nerves weren't eased when I biked into town the next day and overheard talk at the diner. The same group of old-timers who'd laughed about the smashed SUV now spoke in low, cautious tones. Apparently the HOA president himself had filed a petition with the county, demanding a review of unsafe obstructions on public-adjacent property. They weren't just leaning on the sheriff anymore. They were climbing the ladder, trying to bring in county officials, inspectors, maybe even judges. My milkshake curdled in my stomach. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was bureaucracy, and that weapon cuts deeper than chains or sledgehammers. Bureaucracy doesn't just bruise. It bleeds a man dry. When I told Grandpa, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this move all along. "Let them bring their inspectors," he said. "Mailbox is built to spec, and I got the paperwork to prove it." He pulled out a weathered folder from the roll-top desk in his study. Inside were copies of county regulations, highlighted passages, and even a receipt from when he'd bought the reflective markers to comply with visibility standards. He wasn't bluffing. He'd built his fortress not just in steel and concrete, but in paperwork too. Still, I wasn't sure that would stop men with influence and pockets deep enough to twist rules to their liking. The inspection came a week later, on a bright morning that felt too clean for the kind of storm brewing beneath it. A county pickup truck pulled into the drive, 2 men in khakis and clipboards stepping out. They introduced themselves politely enough, but their eyes kept darting to the mailbox like it was a crime scene. Behind them, parked just far enough to keep plausible deniability, sat 2 HOA SUVs, their drivers watching like vultures. The inspectors measured the height, the distance from the road, the reflectors, the base. They scribbled notes, whispered, measured again. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find some technicality to twist against us. Grandpa stood quietly nearby, arms crossed, letting them work without interference. After what felt like hours, one inspector finally cleared his throat. Structurally, it's unusual, he admitted. But it's within county guidelines. Placement, height, distance, all compliant. He glanced back at the SUVs, uncomfortable. We'll file the report. And with that, they left. The SUVs peeled off soon after, no doubt to spin the outcome into another excuse to escalate. I almost shouted with joy, but Grandpa only said, "Never celebrate too soon. A cornered animal's the most dangerous." His words gnawed at me even as relief washed over. He was right. This wasn't the end. This was another line drawn in the dirt, another humiliation for them to avenge. The retaliation didn't take long. 2 nights later, I woke to the stench of gasoline. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and saw the flicker of orange light through the window. Flames licked the side of the barn, spreading fast through dry boards and old hay. I screamed for Grandpa and sprinted outside, grabbing the nearest bucket. But before I reached the pump, he was already there, hose in hand, spraying the flames with the calm urgency of a man who'd fought fire before. We battled it together, coughing through smoke, until the blaze shrank to blackened beams and smoldering ash. The barn was scarred but not lost. The mailbox, standing only a few yards away, remained untouched, gleaming defiantly in the firelight. When the smoke cleared, we found the evidence: an empty gas can discarded in the ditch, tire tracks leading back toward the subdivision. My fists trembled with rage, but Grandpa only knelt by the can, running a calloused hand over the plastic. His face was stone, but his eyes burned hotter than the fire had. "They crossed a line tonight," he said quietly. "Property's one thing. Fire's another. You play with fire, you answer to it. I wanted to call the sheriff, but we both knew how that would go. The report would gather dust, the suspects would be unidentified, and the HOA would laugh over beers about how close they'd come. No, this wasn't for the law to solve. This was for Grandpa." The next day he started building again, but this time it wasn't just the mailbox. He reinforced the barn with sheet metal panels, replaced wood siding with fire-resistant boards, even rigged a water tank with hoses for quick access. He was turning the ranch into a fortress, piece by piece. The mailbox had been the opening salvo. The war was spreading now, and he was readying for siege. I helped him haul materials, drill bolts, paint panels. Sweat soaked my shirt, muscles ached, but I didn't complain. I wasn't just helping him. I was defending the only piece of ground that felt like home. While we built, the HOA plotted. One afternoon, as I was tightening bolts on the water tank, a delivery truck pulled up with a certified letter. It wasn't another fine. It was a summons. They were dragging Grandpa to court. I read the words with a sinking feeling: claims of unsafe structures, public hazards, intentional obstruction. They were twisting the narrative, painting him as the villain, the reckless old man endangering the community. Grandpa read it once, folded it, and slid it into his pocket. "Good," he said. "Now it's official." His calm rattled me. "Good? They're suing you." I protested. He just smiled faintly. "Court's a stage. Time to let them act, and time to let the truth show." The hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later in the county courthouse. The HOA arrived in full force, dressed in suits instead of vests, smug grins plastered across their faces. Their lawyer droned on about safety hazards, reckless construction, diminished property values. They painted pictures of children injured, cars destroyed, chaos unleashed by one man's stubbornness. It was theater, polished and dramatic. But then it was Grandpa's turn. He stood tall, weathered hands steady on the podium, and spoke plainly. He described the harassment, the vandalism, the wrecked SUVs, the night of sledgehammers, the backhoe breakdown. He produced receipts, measurements, photos of the mailbox standing within county spec. He told the story without anger, without theatrics, just truth laid bare. And when he was finished, the courtroom was silent. The engines came closer, their growl rolling across the fields until it rattled the windows. I counted at least 7 SUVs, maybe more, each one bristling with spotlights and decals that looked more like police cruisers than neighborhood patrol cars. Dust hung in the air behind them like smoke from a wildfire. I stood frozen on the porch, fists clenched, while Grandpa rocked slowly in his chair, pipe glowing like a beacon in the dark. He didn't look worried. He looked ready. The convoy slowed as it reached the mailbox, headlights washing over the steel post like interrogation lamp. The SUVs fanned out across the road, forming a barricade of metal and arrogance. Doors opened, and a dozen men stepped out, some carrying flashlights, others clutching long pry bars and chains. One had a bullhorn slung over his shoulder like he was staging a protest rally. The leader emerged last, broad-shouldered, jaw clenched, face flushed with the kind of anger that festers when pride's been wounded too many times. He pointed straight at Grandpa. "You've had your fun, old man. Tonight it ends." I felt my blood boil, but Grandpa only puffed once and said, "Funny you keep saying that, and yet here you are again." His calmness was gasoline on their fire. They stormed closer, flashlights swinging, tools clanging against the chains. The leader raised the bullhorn and his voice cracked through the night. "This mailbox is hereby condemned. You have 5 minutes to remove it or we'll remove it ourselves." His words echoed across the fields, absurd in their formality. Condemned? It wasn't a building, it was a mailbox. But they weren't trying to be logical. They were trying to be dominant. Grandpa leaned forward, pipe clenched between his teeth, and said, "You've already tried chains, trucks, and a backhoe. Didn't work then, won't work now. But if you want to keep breaking your toys, be my guest." The men surged forward, surrounding the post. Chains clinked, straps tightened, SUVs revved, their headlights bouncing as the engines strained. The ground shook as they tried to pull the mailbox from every angle at once. Metal screamed, engines roared, dirt flew in clouds. I braced myself for the impossible, for the mailbox to finally yield under the combined force. But it didn't. It shuddered, it groaned, but it held. One SUV's bumper bent inward, another's axle groaned until it snapped with a hideous crack. A tire blew, the explosion echoing across the night. Shouts of anger, curses, the clang of chains snapping back. Still the mailbox stood tall, its paint glinting under the chaos. I laughed then, a raw, wild laugh that broke free before I could stop it. The absurdity, the futility, the sheer stubbornness of that steel post, it was invincible. The laughter drew their fury like blood in the water. One of the younger men spun on me, eyes blazing, and shouted, "Think this is funny?" He raised his pry bar like he meant to charge. My body stiffened, ready to fight or flee, but Grandpa stood in one smooth motion, pipe smoke curling around him like battle fog. "That's enough," he said, voice deep and sharp. The words cut through the chaos, freezing everyone mid-motion. Even the engines seemed to hesitate. The man with the pry bar lowered it slowly, his chest heaving. Grandpa stepped down off the porch, boots crunching gravel, and walked right up to the wrecked line of SUVs. He looked each of them in the eye, steady, unflinching. "You boys think this is about a mailbox. It's not. It's about respect. And you've mistaken stubbornness for weakness." He jabbed his pipe stem toward the bent bumper of the leader's SUV. "But weakness doesn't build things that last. Weakness doesn't outlast chains and machines. Weakness folds. I don't fold. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, at the wreckage of their vehicles, at the unbroken mailbox. Pride battled with fear in their eyes. They wanted to lash out, but they couldn't deny the truth standing unmovable before them. Finally the leader snapped, voice shaking with rage. You think you've won? You think this proves anything? We've got connections, money, lawyers. You're just one old man on a patch of dirt. You can't fight forever. Grandpa's gaze didn't waver. Maybe not. But I don't have to. Because every day you come here, every dollar you waste, every truck you break, you prove to yourselves that you're smaller than the ground I stand on. His words were simple, but they hit harder than any chain. The men looked away, ashamed or furious or both. Then came the sound none of us expected, sirens. Not the fake whoops from HOA patrol speakers, but real sirens, wailing through the night, drawing closer fast. Blue and red lights flashed against the dust, cutting through the chaos. A county sheriff's cruiser roared up behind the convoy, followed by a fire truck and 2 more cruisers. The HOA men froze, caught mid-act, tools in hand, chains still dangling from their SUVs. The sheriff stepped out, not the same smooth talker from before but one of his deputies, younger, harder, less political. He swept his flashlight across the scene, taking in the wrecked vehicles, the broken chains, the unscathed mailbox. His face tightened. What the hell is going on here? The HOA leader stammered, trying to spin it. This man, this mailbox, it's a hazard, we're just enforcing. The deputy cut him off sharp. Enforcing what? You don't have jurisdiction out here. You're trespassing, vandalizing, and endangering lives. Everyone here drop your tools and step away from the property. His voice cracked like a whip. The men hesitated, stunned, some lowering their chains, others backing toward their SUVs. The leader sputtered, "We're the HOA Safety Division." The deputy's laugh was cold. "You're a bunch of suburban dads playing cops with decals and clipboards. And tonight you crossed a line." He motioned to the other deputies, who began writing citations, recording license plates, even cuffing 2 of the more aggressive men who had pry bars in hand. The fire crew checked the barn, making sure no new flames had been set, while the deputy kept his flashlight trained on the so-called patrol. I stood there, heart pounding, as the weight of the moment sank in. After months of harassment, vandalism, threats, and fire, justice had finally stepped in. Not because Grandpa had begged for it. Not because we'd asked. But because the HOA had gone so far that even the law couldn't look the other way. The leader was red-faced, spitting curses as he was shoved into the back of a cruiser. His SUV, still crippled from the mailbox, sat useless on the roadside. One by one, the convoy scattered, some cuffed, some fined, some humiliated beyond words. The deputy turned to Grandpa at last, his voice softening. "You all right, sir?" Grandpa nodded once. "Never better." And he meant it. After they left, silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy silence of plotting. It was clean, fresh, like a storm had broken and left the air washed. I turned to Grandpa, expecting him to finally show relief, maybe even smile. Instead he tamped down his pipe, lit it again, and said, "That's round 6. 1 more to go." I blinked at him, stunned. 1 more? They just got hauled off in cuffs. What else could there be? He stared at the mailbox, the smoke from his pipe curling around his hat brim. "You'll see. Pride doesn't die easy. There's always one last swing." The SUV crawled closer, its headlights still off, moving slow and deliberate like a predator testing the edge of a herd. I held my breath, watching from the upstairs window, heart hammering against my ribs. Unlike the convoys before, this wasn't about spectacle. This was quiet, calculated, desperate. I slipped into my jeans and boots, crept down the stairs, and eased open the front door just enough to see. Grandpa was already on the porch, pipe glowing faintly, as if he'd been waiting all along. His rocking chair creaked once, steady and unhurried. He didn't need me to tell him someone was coming. He knew. He always knew. The SUV rolled to a stop by the mailbox, engine idling low, exhaust curling in the cool night air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and the broad-shouldered leader stepped out, the same man who'd sworn he'd bury us in lawsuits, the same one humiliated when his backhoe broke down and his bumper bent. His vest was gone, his fake badge too. He wore only a wrinkled button-up and slacks, like he'd come straight from a meeting gone wrong. His face sagged with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not arrogance. Desperation. He stood in the glow of his SUV's parking lights, staring at the mailbox like it was the last enemy soldier on a battlefield. Then he pulled something from the back seat, a red canister, small but unmistakable. Gasoline. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about chains or trucks anymore. This was about fire. Fire that could take more than just a mailbox. Fire that could spread to the barn, the house, the fields. I almost bolted forward, but Grandpa's voice stopped me cold. Stay where you are. His tone wasn't harsh, just final. I froze in the doorway, fists clenched, powerless. The man unscrewed the cap, sloshed gasoline over the base of the mailbox, his motions jerky, uneven. He muttered to himself, words I couldn't catch, curses drowned by the chirp of cricket. He struck a match. For a second, the flame hovered between his trembling fingers and the gasoline-soaked ground. One flick, and everything could ignite. My chest burned with panic. But then Grandpa's voice cut through the night, calm and steady. Son, that flame doesn't burn what you think it does. It burns you. The man froze, match trembling. He looked up, eyes wild, locked on Grandpa. You think you've won, he spat. You embarrassed us, made fools of us. Everyone's laughing. I can't go back like this. I can't. His voice cracked, breaking apart into something that sounded almost like grief. The match wavered dangerously close to the gasoline. My legs screamed to move, to stop him, but Grandpa rose slowly from his chair and stepped down onto the porch. He didn't rush. He didn't threaten. He just walked forward, boots crunching gravel, until he stood a few feet from the man and his shaking hand. You came out here to prove you had power, Grandpa said softly. But all you proved is you don't know when to stop. That's not power. That's weakness dressed up in noise. He took another step closer. The flame flickered, the man's hand trembling harder. Look around you. You've got money, friends, houses stacked so close together you can smell each other's dinners. And yet here you are, one man in the dark, ready to burn yourself down over a mailbox you couldn't move. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The match flared, then shrank as the man's grip faltered. His face twisted, rage and shame warring inside him. Then, with a guttural shout, he hurled the match into the dirt, stomping it out before it could catch. Gasoline fumes hung heavy in the air, but the ground remained dark, unlit. He threw the can aside, shoulders heaving, breath ragged. This isn't over, he hissed, though the words carried no conviction. Grandpa shook his head slowly. It's been over since the day you hit that post the first time. You just couldn't admit it. He turned, walked back to the porch, and sat down again, pipe glowing as if the exchange had never happened. The man stood there, fists clenching and unclenching, chest heaving. Finally, with a strangled sound of defeat, he staggered back to his SUV, slammed the door, and peeled away into the night. Dust swallowed him whole, leaving only silence and the faint scent of gasoline. I stepped out at last, legs shaking. You let him go, I said, half a question, half an accusation. Grandpa puffed once, eyes fixed on the dark road. I didn't let him. He let himself. Pride only dies when a man chooses to bury it. I stared at the unscathed mailbox, gleaming in the faint moonlight, and realized it wasn't just steel and bolt. It was a monument. A reminder that some things can't be moved by force, no matter how many chains or threats or fires you throw at them. The days that followed carried an odd calm. No more SUVs prowled the roads. No more letters, no more anonymous calls. Word spread through the county faster than wildfire. The HOA patrol had been broken. Their leader stopped showing up at meetings, his SUV parked in his driveway with a bumper still bent. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved when they passed our gate, some even stopping to shake Grandpa's hand, muttering thanks for standing up when no one else dared. The mailbox became a kind of legend, a story told at the diner, at the feed store, even whispered at the church potluck. Folks called it the unbreakable post. Kids dared each other to touch it, as if it carried the power of a lightning rod. Grandpa never bragged. He never told the story himself. He just sat on the porch, pipe smoke curling, rocking steady, as if he'd done nothing more than tend to his land. When I asked him why he didn't tell people what really happened, he just shrugged. Truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to last. But I knew. I'd seen every round of the fight. I'd watched SUVs crumple, chains snap, machines fail, men humiliate themselves against a single post of steel and willpower. I'd smelled the smoke of gasoline that never lit, heard the sirens that finally came when the law couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd seen pride clash with patience and lose. And I knew that the real victory wasn't the mailbox still standing. It was the man behind it, unshaken, unbroken, steady as the land itself. Months later, as summer burned into fall, I caught myself staring at that mailbox again. The paint was scratched, the steel dented in places, but it stood as straight as the day he'd planted it. Letters still slid into it every morning, bills and catalogs and birthday cards from cousins. Life moved on. The war faded into story, then into legend, then into silence. But every time I looked at it, I remembered the convoy headlights, the roar of chains, the hiss of broken hydraulics, the flash of a match that almost burned the night. And I remembered Grandpa's voice, calm as ever, saying patience wins what force never can. One evening, long after the war had ended, I asked him if he'd ever worried the mailbox wouldn't hold. He looked at me, eyes sharp under his hat brim, and said, "It's not about the box, boy. It's about what it stands for. Build something strong enough, inside and out, and it doesn't matter how many times they hit it. It'll outlast the storm,